I don't have to do it? She asked eagerly. Yes, she was thinking only of herself now. He was alone. Bigger, tell me what happened. They know all about it. They'll be after me soon. Her eyes were too filled with fear to cry. He walked about aimlessly, and his shoes left rings of dirty water on the wooden floor. Tell me, Bigger, please. She was wanting the word that would free her of this nightmare, but he would not give it to her. No, let her be with him. Let somebody be with him now. She caught hold of his coat, and he felt her body trembling. Will they come for me too, Bigger? I didn't want to do it. Yes, he would let her know everything, but let her know in a way that would bind her to him, at least a little longer. He did not want to be alone now. They found the girl, he said. What we going to do, Bigger? Look what you done to me. She began to cry. Aw, come on, kid. You really killed her? She's dead, he said. They found her. She ran to the bed, fell upon it, and sobbed. With her mouth all twisted and her eyes wet, she asked in gasps, You didn't send the letter? Yeah. Bigger, she whimpered. There ain't no help for it now. Oh, Lord, they'll come for me. They'll know you did it, and they'll go to your home and talk to your ma and brother and everybody. They'll come for me now, for sure. That was true. There was no way for her but to come with him. If she stayed here, they would come to her, and she would simply lie on the bed and sob out everything. She would not be able to help it. And what she would tell them about him, his habits, his life, would help track him down. You got the money? It's in my dress pocket. How much is it? $90. Well, what you planning to do? He asked. I wish I could kill myself. Ain't no use in talking that way. There ain't no way else to talk. It was a shot in the dark, but he decided to try it. If you don't act better in this, I'll just leave. Nah, Bigger, she cried, rising and running to him. Well, snap out of it, he said, backing to a chair. He sat down and felt how tired he was. Some strength he did not know he possessed had enabled him to run away, to stand here and talk with her. But now he felt that he would not have strength enough to run, even if the police should suddenly burst into the room. You hurt? She asked, catching hold of his shoulder. He leaned forward in the chair and rested his face in the palm of his hands. Bigger, what's the matter? I'm tired and awfully sleepy, he sighed. Let me fix you something to eat. I need a drink. Nah, no whiskey. You need some hot milk. He waited, hearing her move about. It seemed that his body had turned to a piece of lead and was cold and heavy and wet and aching. Bessie switched on her electric stove, emptied a bottle of milk into the pan, and set it up on the glowing red circle. She came back to him and placed her hand upon his shoulders, her eyes wet with fresh tears. I'm scared, Bigger. You can't be scared now. You oughtn't have killed her, honey. I didn't mean to. I couldn't help it, I swear. What happened? You never told me. Aw, hell. I was in her room. Her room? Yeah, she was drunk. She passed out. I took her there. What'd she do? Nothing. She didn't do anything. Her mom came in. She's blind. The girl? Nah, her ma. I didn't want her to find me there. Well, the girl was trying to say something and I was scared. I just put the edge of the pillow in her mouth and I didn't mean to kill her. I just pulled the pillow over her face and she died. Her mom came into the room and the girl was trying to say something and her ma had her hand stretched out like this. See? I was scared she was going to touch me. I just sort of pushed the pillow hard over the girl's face to keep her from yelling. Her ma didn't touch me. I got out of the way. But when I left, I went to the bed and the girl, she was dead. That was all. She was dead. I didn't mean... You didn't plan to kill her? Nah, I swear I didn't. But what's the use? Nobody will believe me. Honey, don't you see? What? They'll say... Bessie cried again. He caught in her face and her hands. He was concerned. He wanted to see the thing through her eyes at the moment. What? They'll say you raped her. Bigger stared. He had entirely forgotten the moment when he had carried Mary up the stairs. So deeply had he pushed it all back down into him that it was not until now that its real meaning came back. They would say he had raped her, and there would be no way to prove that he had not. The fact had not assumed importance in his eyes until now. He stood up, his jaws hardening. Had he raped her? Yes, he had raped her. Every time he felt as if he had felt that night, he raped. But rape was not what one did to women. Rape was what one felt when one's back was against a wall and one had to strike out, whether one wanted to or not, or keep the pack from killing one. He committed rape every time he looked into a white face. He was a long, taut piece of rubber which 1,000 white hands had stretched to the snapping point, and when he snapped it was rape. But it was rape when he cried out in hate, deep hate in his heart, and he felt the strain of living day by day. That too was rape. They found her, Bessie asked. Huh? They found her. Yeah, her bones. Bones? Ah, Bessie, I didn't know what to do. I put her in the furnace. Bessie flung her face to his wet coat and wailed violently. Bigger, huh? What we going to do? I don't know. They'll be looking for us. They got my picture. Where can we hide? We can stay in some of them old houses for a while, but they might find us there. There's plenty of them. It'll be like hiding in a jungle. The milk on the stove boiled over. Bessie rose, her lips still twisted with sobs, and turned off the electric switch. She poured out a glass of milk and brought it to him. He sipped it slowly, then set the glass aside and leaned over again. They were silent. Bessie gave him the glass once more, and he drank it down, then another glass. He stood up, his legs and entire body feeling heavy and sleepy. Get your clothes on and get them blankets and quilts. We gotta get out of here. She went to the bed and rolled the covers back, rolling the pillows with them. As she worked, Bigger went to her and put his hands on her shoulders. Where's the bottle? She got it from her purse and gave it to him. He drank a long swallow and she put it back. Hurry up, he said. She sobbed softly as she worked, pausing now and then to wipe tears from her eyes. Bigger stood in the middle of the floor, thinking, maybe they're searching at home now. Maybe they're talking to Ma and Vera and Buddy. He crossed the floor and twitched back the curtains and looked out. The streets were white and empty. He turned and saw Bessie bent motionless over the pile of bedclothing. Come on, we gotta get out of here. I don't care what happens. Come on, you can't act like that. What could he do with her? She would be a dangerous burden. It would be impossible to take her if she were going to act like this, and yet he could not leave her here. Coldly, he knew that he had to take her with him, and then at some future time settle things with her. Settle them in a way that would not leave him in any danger. He thought of it calmly, as if the decision were being handed down to him by some logic not of his own, over which he had no control, but which he had to obey. You want me to leave you here? Nah, Bigger. Well, come on, get your hat and coat. She was facing him. Then she sank to her knees. Oh, Lord, she moaned, what's the use of running? They'll catch us anywhere. I should have known this would happen. She clenched her hands in front of her and rocked to and fro with her eyes closed upon gushing tears. All my life's been full of hard trouble. If I wasn't hungry, I was sick. And if I wasn't sick, I was in trouble. I ain't never bothered nobody. I just worked hard every day as long as I can remember, till I was tired enough to drop. Then I had to get drunk to forget it. I had to get drunk to sleep. That's all I ever did. And now I'm in this. They looking for me, and when they catch me, they'll kill me. She bent her head to the floor. God only knows why I ever let you treat me this way. I wish to God I never seen you. I wish one of us had died before we was born. God knows I do. All you ever caused me was trouble, just plain black trouble. All you ever did since we've been knowing each other was to get me drunk so you could have me. That was all. I see it now. I ain't drunk now. I see everything you did to me. I didn't want to see it before. I was too busy thinking about how good I felt when I was with you. I thought I was happy. But deep down in me, I knew I wasn't. But you got me into this murder, and I see it all now. I've been a fool, just a blind, dumb, black, drunk fool. Now I gotta run away, and I know deep down in your heart you really don't care. She stopped, choked. He had not listened to what she had said. Her words had made leap to consciousness in him 1,000 details of her life, which he had long known, and they made him see that she was in no condition to be taken along, and at the same time in no condition to be left behind. It was not with anger or regret that he thought this, but as a man seeing what he must do to save himself and feeling resolved to do it. Come on, Bessie. We can't stay here like this. He stooped and with one hand caught hold of her arm and with the other lifted the bundle of bedclothes. He dragged her across the threshold and pulled the door after him. He went down the steps. She came stumbling behind, whimpering. When he reached the vestibule, he got his gun from inside his shirt and put it in the pocket of his coat. He might have to use it any minute now. The moment he stepped out of the door, he would have his life in his hands. Whatever happened now depended upon him, and when he felt it that way, some of his fear left. It was simple again. He opened the door, and an icy blast of wind struck his face. He drew back and turned to Bessie. Where's the bottle? She held out her purse. He got the bottle and took a deep drink. Here, he said, you better take one. She drank and put the bottle back in the purse. They went into the snow, over the frozen street, through the sweeping wind. Once she stopped and began to cry. He grabbed her arm. Shut up now. Come on. They stopped in front of a tall, snow-covered building whose many windows gaped blackly, like the eye sockets of empty skulls. He took the purse from her and got the flashlight. He clutched her arm and pulled her up the steps to the front door. It was half ajar. He put his shoulder to it, and it gave a stout shove. It yielded grudgingly. It was black inside, and the feeble glow of the flashlight did not help much. A sharp scent of rot floated to him, and he heard the scurrying of quick, dry feet over the wooden floor. Bessie sucked in her breath deeply, about to scream, but Bigger gripped her arms so hard that she bent halfway over and moaned. As he went up the steps, there came frequently to his ears a slight creak, as of a tree bending in the wind. With one hand he held her wrist, the bundle of bedclothes under his arm. With the other he beat off the clinging, filmy spider webs that came thick into his lips and eyes. He walked to the third floor, into a room that had a window opening to a narrow air shaft. It stank of old timber. He circled the spot of a flashlight. The floor was carpeted with black dirt, and he saw 2 bricks lying in the corner. He looked at Bessie. Her hands covered her face, and he could see the damp tears of her black fingers. He dropped the bundle of bedclothes. Unroll them and spread them out. She obeyed. He placed the 2 pillows near the window so that when he lay down, the window would be just above his head. He was so cold that his teeth chattered. Bessie stood by a wall, leaning against it, crying. "Take it easy," he said. He hoisted the window and looked up the air shaft. Snow flew above the roof of the house. He looked downward and saw nothing but black darkness, into which now and then a few flakes of white floated from the sky, falling slowly in the dim glow of the flashlight. He lowered the window and turned back to Bessie. She had not moved. He crossed the floor and took the purse from her and got the half-filled flask and drank it. It was good. It burned in his stomach, and it took the mind off the cold and the sound of the wind outside. He sat on the edge of the pallet and lit a cigarette. It was the first one he had smoked in a long time. He sucked the hot smoke deep into his lungs and blew it out slowly. The whiskey heated him all over, making his head whirl. Bessie cried softly, piteously. "Come on and lay down," he said. He took the gun from his coat pocket and put it where he could reach it. "Come on, Bessie, you'll freeze standing there like that." He stood up and pulled off his overcoat and spread it upon the top of the blanket for additional cover, then switched off the flashlight. The whiskey lulled him, numbed his senses. Bessie's soft whimpers came to him through the cold. He took a long last draw from the cigarette and crushed it. Bessie's shoes creaked over the floor. He lay quietly, feeling the warmth of the alcohol spreading through him. He was tense inside. It was as though he had been compelled to hold himself in a certain awkward posture for a long time, and when he had the chance to relax, he could not. He was tense with desire, but as long as he knew that Bessie was standing there in the room, he kept it from his mind. Bessie was worried, and not to her should his mind turn now in that way. But that part of him which always made him at least outwardly adjusted to what was expected of him made him now keep what his body wanted out of full consciousness. He heard Bessie's clothes rustling in the darkness, and he knew that she was pulling off her coat. Soon she would be lying there beside him. He waited for her. After a few moments, he felt his fingers pass lightly over his face. She was seeking for the pallet. He reached out, groping, and found her arm. "Here, lay down." He held the cover for her. She slid down beside him and stretched out. Now that she was close to him, the whiskey made him whirl faster, and the tensity of his body mounted. A gust of wind rattled the window pane and made the old building creak. He felt snug and warm, even though he knew he was in danger. The building might fall upon him as he slept, but the police might get him if he were anywhere else. He laid his fingers upon Bessie's shoulder. Slowly he felt the stiffness go out of her body, and as it left, the tensity in his own rose, and his blood grew hotter. "Cold?" he asked in a soft whisper. "Yeah," she breathed. "Get close to me." "I never thought I'd be like this." "It won't be like this always. I'd just as soon as die right now." "Don't say that. I'm cold all over. I feel like I'll never get warm." He drew her closer till he felt her breath coming full in his face. The wind swept against the window pane in the building, whining, and then whispered out into silence. He turned from his back and laid face with her on his side. He kissed her. Her lips were cold. He kept kissing her until her lips grew warm and soft. A huge warm pull of desire rose in him, insistent and demanding. He let his hand slide from her shoulder to her breast, feeling one, then the other. He slipped his other arm beneath her head, kissing her again, hard and long. "Bigger, please." She tried to turn from him, but his arm held her tightly. She lay still, whimpering. He heard her sigh, a sigh he knew, for he had heard it many times before. But this time he heard it in a sigh deep down beneath the familiar one, a sigh of resignation, a giving up, a surrender of something more than her body. Her head lay limp in the crook of his arm, and his hand reached for the hem of her dress, caught it in his fingers, and gathered it up slowly. His cold fingers touched her warm flesh and sought still warmer and softer flesh. Bessie was still, unresisting, without response. His icy fingers touched inside of her, and at once she spoke, not a word, but the sound that gave forth the meaning of horror accepted. Her breath went out of her lungs in long, soft gasps that turned into a whisper of pleading. "Bigger, don't." Her voice came to him now from a deep, faraway silence, and he paid her no heed. The loud demand of the tensity of his own body was a voice that drowned out hers. In the cold darkness of the room, it seemed that he was on some vast turning wheel that made him want to turn faster and faster. Then in turning faster, he would get warmth and sleep and be rid of his tense fatigue. He was conscious of nothing now but her and what he wanted. He flung the cover back, ignoring the cold, and not knowing that he did it. Bessie's hands were on his chest, her fingers spreading protestingly open, pushing him away. He heard her give a soft moan that seemed not to end even when she breathed in or out, a moan which he heard too from far away and without heeding. He had to now. Yes, Bessie. His desire was naked and hot in his hand, and his fingers were touching hers. Yes, Bessie, now. He had to now. Don't, Bigger, don't. He was sorry, but he had to. He could not help it. Help it, sorry, help it, sorry, help it, sorry, help it now. She should look. She should look. Look at how he was. He was. He was feeling bad now. How she would feel, but he could not help it now. Feeling, Bessie, now, all. He heard her breathing heavily and his own breath going and coming heavily. Bigger, now, all, now, all, bigger. He lay still, feeling rid of that hunger and tenseness in hearing the wail of the night wind over and above his and her breathing. He turned from her and lay on his back again, stretching his legs wide apart. He felt the tenseness flow gradually from him. His breathing grew less and less heavy and rapid until he could no longer hear it, then so slowly and steady that the consciousness of breathing left him entirely. He was not at all sleepy, and he lay, feeling Bessie lying there beside him. He turned his head in the darkness toward her. Her breath came to him slowly. He wondered if she were sleeping. Somewhere deep in him, he knew that she was lying there waiting for her to go to sleep. Bessie did not figure in what was before him. He remembered that he had seen 2 bricks lying on the floor of the room when he had entered. He tried to recall just where they were, but could not. But he was sure they were there somewhere. He would have to find them, at least one of them. It would have been much better if he had not said anything to Bessie about the murder. Well, it was her own fault. She had bothered him so much that he had had to tell her. And how on earth could he have known that they would find Mary's bones in the furnace so soon? He felt no regret as the image of the smoking furnace and the white pieces of bone came back to him. He had gazed straight at those bones for almost a full minute and had not been able to realize that they were the bones of Mary. He had thought that they might find out some other way and then suddenly confront him with the evidence. Never did he think that he would stand and look at the evidence and not know it. His thoughts came back to the room. What about Bessie? He listened to her breathing. He could not take her with him, and he could not leave her behind. Yes, she was asleep. He reconstructed in his mind the details of the room as he had seen them by the glow of the flashlight when he had first come in. The window was directly behind him, above his head. The flashlight was at his side. The gun was lying beside the flashlight, the handle pointing towards him, so he could get it quickly and be in a position to use it. But he could not use the gun. That would make too much noise. He would have to use a brick. He remembered hoisting the window. It had not been hard. Yes, that was what he could do, throw it out of the window, down the narrow air shaft where nobody would find it until, perhaps, it had begun to smell. He could not leave her here, and he could not take her with him. If he took her along, she would be crying all the time. She would be blaming him for all that had happened. She would be wanting whiskey to help her forget, and there would be times when he could not get it for her. The room was black, dark, and silent. The city did not exist. He sat up slowly, holding his breath, listening. Bessie's breath was regular, deep. He could not take her, and he could not leave her. He stretched out his hand and caught the flashlight. He listened again. Her breath came like the sleep of the tired. He was holding the covers off by sitting up his way, and he did not want her to get cold and awaken. He eased the covers back. Still, she slept. His fingers pressed a button on the flashlight, and a dim spot of yellow leaped to life on the opposite wall. Quickly, he lowered it to the floor for fear that it might disturb her. And as he did so, there passed before his eyes in a split second of time one of the bricks he had glimpsed when he had first come into the room. He stiffened. Bessie stirred restlessly. Her deep, regular breathing had stopped. He listened but could not hear it. He saw her breath as a white thread stretching out over a vast black gulf, and felt that he was clinging to it and was waiting to see if the ravel in the white thread which had started would continue and let him drop to the rocks far below. Then he heard her breathing again, in, out, in, out. He, too, breathed again, struggling now with his own breath to control it, to keep it from sounding so loud in his throat that it would awaken her. The fear that had gripped him when she had stirred made him realize that it would have to be quick and sure. Softly, he poked his legs from beneath the blanket, then waited. Bessie breathed, slow, long, heavy, regular. He lifted his arm and the blanket fell away. He stood up and his muscles lifted his body in slow motion. Outside in the cold night, the wind moaned and died down, like an idiot in an icy black pit. Turning, he centered the disk of light where he thought Bessie's face must be. Yes, she was asleep. Her black face, stained with tears, was calm. He switched off the light, turned toward the wall, and his fingers felt over the cold floor for the brick. He found it, gripped it in his hand, and tiptoed back to the pallet. Her breath guided him in the darkness. He stopped where he thought her head must be. He couldn't take her, and he couldn't leave her, so he would have to kill her. It was his life against hers. Quickly, to make certain where he must strike, he switched on the light, fearing as he did so that it might awaken her. Then switched it off again, retaining as an image before his eyes her black face, calm in deep sleep. He straightened and lifted the brick, but just at that moment, the reality of it all slipped from him. His heart beat wildly, trying to force its way out of his chest. No, not this. His breath swelled deep in his lungs, and he flexed his muscles, trying to impose his will over his body. He had to do better than this. Then, as suddenly as the panic had come, it left. But he had to stand here until the picture came back, that motive, that driving desire to escape the law. Yes, it must be this way. A sense of the white blur hovering near, of Mary burning, of Britain, of the law tracking him down, came back. Again he was ready. The brick was in his hand. In his mind, his hand traced a quick invisible arc through the cold air of the room. High above his head, his hand paused in fancy and imaginatively swooped down to where he thought her head must be. He was rigid, not moving. This was the way it had to be. Then he took a deep breath, and his hand gripped the brick and shot upward and paused a second and then plunged downward through the darkness to the accompaniment of a deep, short grunt from his chest that landed with a thud. Yes, there was a dull gasp of surprise, then a moan. No, that must not be it. He lifted the brick again and again until, in falling, it struck a sodden mass that gave softly but stoutly to each landing blow. Soon he seemed to be striking a wet wad of cotton, of some damp substance whose only life was the jarring of the brick's impact. He stopped, hearing his own breath heaving in and out of his chest. He was wet all over and cold. How many times had he lifted the brick and brought it down, and he did not know. All he knew was that the room was quiet and cold, and the job was done. In his left hand, he still held the flashlight, gripping it for sheer life. He wanted to switch it on and see if he had really done it, but he could not. His knees were slightly bent, like a runner's poised for a race. Fear was in him again. He strained his ears. Didn't he hear her breathing? He bent and listened. It was his own breathing he heard. He had been breathing so loud that he had not been able to tell if Bessie was breathing or not. His fingers on the brick began to ache. He had been gripping it for some minutes with all the strength in his body. He was conscious of something warm and sticky on his hand, and a sense of it covered him, all over. It cast a warm glow that enveloped the surface of his skin. He wanted to drop the brick, wanted to be free of the warm blood that crept and grew powerful with each passing moment. Then a dreadful thought rendered him incapable of action. Suppose Bessie was not as she had sounded when the brick hit her. Suppose when he turned on the flashlight, he would see her lying there staring at him with those round, large black eyes, her bloody mouth open in awe, in wonder and pain and accusation. A cold chill, colder than the air of the room, closed about his shoulders like the shawl whose strands were woven of ice. It became unbearable, and something within him cried out in silent agony. He stooped until the brick touched the floor, then loosened his fingers, bringing his hand to his stomach where he wiped it dry upon his coat. Gradually, his breathing subsided until he could no longer hear it, and then he knew for certain that Bessie was not breathing. The room was filled with quiet and cold and death and blood and the deep moan of the night wind. But he had to look. He lifted the flashlight to where he thought her head must be and pressed the button. The yellow spot sprang wide and dim on an empty stretch of floor. He moved it over a full circle of crumpled bedcloths. There, blood and lips and hair and face turned to one side and blood running slowly. She seemed limp. He could act now. He turned off the light. Could he leave her here? No, somebody might find her. Avoiding her, he stepped to the far side of the pallet, then turned in the dark. He centered the spot of light where he thought the window must be. He walked to the window and stopped, waiting to hear someone challenge his right to do what he was doing. Nothing happened. He caught hold of the window, hoisted it up slowly, and the wind blasted his face. He turned to Bessie again, threw the light upon the face of death and blood. He put the flashlight in his pocket and stepped carefully in the dark to her side. He would have to lift her in his arms. His arms hung loosely and did not move. He just stood. But he had to move her. He had to get her to the window. He stooped and slid his hand beneath her body, expecting to touch blood, but not touching it. Then he lifted her, feeling the wind screaming a protest against him. He stepped to the window and lifted her into it. He was working fast now that he had started. He pushed her out as far in his arms as possible, then let go. The body hit and bumped against the narrow sides of the air shafts as it went down into blackness. He heard it strike the bottom. He turned the light upon the pallet, half expecting her to still be there, but there was only a pool of warm blood, a faint veil of vapor hovering in the air above it. Blood was on the pillows, too. He took them and threw them out the window down the air shaft. It was over. He eased the window down. He would take the pallet into another room. He wished he could leave it there, but it was cold and he needed it. He rolled the quilts and blankets into a bundle and picked it up and went into the hall. Then he stopped abruptly, his mouth open. Good God. Goddamn yes, it was in her dress pocket. Now he was in for it. He had thrown Bessie down the air shaft and the money was in the pocket of her dress. What could he do about it now? Should he go down and get it? Anguish gripped him. Nah. He did not want to see her again. He felt that if he should ever see her face again, he would be overcome with a sense of guilt so deep as to be unbearable. That was a dumb thing to do, he thought, throwing her away with all that money in her pocket. He sighed and went through the hall and entered another room. Well, he would have to do without money, that was all. He spread the quilts upon the floor and rolled himself into them. He had 7 cents between him and starvation and the long, long days ahead. He closed his eyes, longing for sleep that would not come. During the last 2 days and nights, he lived so hard and fast that it was an effort to keep it all real in his mind. So close and had danger and death come that he could not feel that it was he who had undergone it all. And yet, out of it all, over and above all that had happened, impalpable but real, there remained to him a queer sense of power. He had done this. He had brought this all about. In all of his life, these 2 murders were the most meaningful thing that had ever happened to him. He was living, truly and deeply, no matter what the others might think. Looking at him with their blind eyes, never had he had the chance to live out the consequence of his actions. Never had his will been so free as in the night and day of fear and murder and flight. He had killed twice, but in a true sense it was not the first time he had ever killed. He had killed many times before, but only during the last 2 days had this impulse assumed the form of actual killing. Blind anger had come often and had either gone behind his curtain or wall or had quarreled and fought. And yet, whether in a running way or in a fighting way, he had felt the need of the clean satisfaction of facing this thing in all its fullness, of fighting it in and out of the wind and sunlight, in front of those who hate him for so unfathomably deep that, after they had shunted him off into a corner of the city to rot and die, they could turn to him, as Mary had that night in the car, and say, "I'd like to know how your people live." But what was he after? What did he want? What did he love and what did he hate? He did not know. There was something he knew and something he felt, something the world gave him and something he himself had, something spread out in front of him and something spread out and back. And never in all his life, with this black skin of his, had the 2 worlds, thought and feeling, will and mind, aspiration and satisfaction, been together. Never had he felt a sense of wholeness. Sometimes in the room or on the sidewalk, the world seemed to him a strange labyrinth, even when the streets were straight and the walls were square. Chaos which had made him feel that something in him would be able to understand it, divide it, focus it. But only under the stress of hate was the conflict resolved. He had been so conditioned in a cramped environment that hard words or kicks alone knocked him upright and made him capable of action. Action that was futile because the world was too much for him. It was then that he closed his eyes and struck out blindly, hitting the what or whom he could, not looking or caring what or who hit back. And under it all, and this made him hard for it, he did not want to believe that it was solved, make believe that he was happy when he was not. He had hated his mother for the way of hers which was like Bessie's. What his mother had was Bessie's whiskey, and Bessie's whiskey was his mother's religion. He did not want to sit on a bench and sing or lie in a corner and sleep. It was when he read the newspapers or magazines, went to the movies, or walked along the streets with crowds that he felt what he wanted, to merge himself with others and be part of this world, to lose himself in it so he could find himself, to be allowed to chance to live like others even though he was black. He turned restlessly on this hard pallet and groaned. He had been caught up in a whirl of thought and feeling which had swept him onward, and when he opened his eyes he saw that daylight stood outside of a dirty window just above his head. He jumped up and looked out. The snow had stopped falling in the city. White still was a vast stretch of rooftops and sky. He had been thinking about it for 2 hours here in the dark, and now there it was, all white still. But what he had not thought about had made it real with a reality it did not have now in the daylight. When lying in the dark thinking of it, it seemed to have something which left it when it was looked at. Why should not this cold white world rise up in a beautiful dream in which he could walk and be at home, in which it would be easy to tell what to do and what not to do? If only someone had gone before and lived or suffered or died, made it so that it could be understood. It was too stark, not redeemed, not made real with the reality that the warm blood of life. He felt that there was something missing, some road which, if he had once found it, would have led him to a sure and quiet knowledge. But why think of that now? A chance for that was gone forever. He had committed murder twice and created a new world for himself.